So 72-year-old Harvey Weinstein. His 2020 rape conviction in the state of New York has been overturned by a court of appeals. He was originally found guilty of sexually assaulting Miriam Haley, a former production assistant on Project Runway, at his apartment in 2006. And when he was found guilty of this, he was sentenced to 23 years in prison, which is where he has been. Right, he's been behind bars. But this New York Court of Appeals has overturned this. It was a 4-3 ruling. And this ruling found that the judge in the original trial had shown prejudice by allowing women to testify about allegations unrelated to the case, right? So this is like what's called, it's like a French word. It must mean something, but I didn't have time to look into this. But a molyneux witness? Essentially where it's like you bring in these witnesses that have allegations against the defendant to show a pattern, right? And we have the judge here, Judge Jenny Rivera, who wrote in the majority opinion of this overturning of this conviction, saying, quote, "It is an abuse of judicial discretion to permit untested allegations of nothing more than bad behavior that destroys the defendant's character, but sheds no light on their credibility as related to the criminal charges lodged against them," end quote. So this idea that it's like, okay, that's all great, but these are all allegations that the defendant has not been charged, has not been convicted of, let alone charged with. So essentially they're inadmissible. We do have the dissenting opinion from Judge Madeline Singas saying, quote, "With today's decision, this court continues to thwart the steady gains survivors of sexual violence have fought for in our criminal justice system. Forgotten are the women who bear the psychological trauma of sexual violence and the scars of testifying again and again. This erosion of precedent, born from a refusal to accept that crimes of sexual violence are far more nuanced and complex than other crimes, comes at the expense and safety of women," end quote. And this was also another quote we have here from Judge Singas saying, quote, "Men who serially sexually exploit their power over women, especially the most vulnerable groups in society, will reap the benefits of today's decision. Under the majority's logic, instances in which a trafficker repeatedly leverages workers' undocumented status to coerce them into sex, or a restaurant manager withholding tips from his employees unless they perform sexual acts, becomes a series of individual credibility contests and unrelated misunderstandings. After today's holding, juries will remain in the dark about, and defendants will be insulated from past criminal acts, even after putting intent at issue by claiming consent," end quote. So I know that was a long thing, but I think that really sums up the dissenting opinion here, and that, you know, this may be a rule, but maybe we need to change the rules here for sexual crimes, because they're just, the nature of them is different, right? Because a murder happened or it didn't happen, right? Whereas an act of sexual interaction, there's two levels to it. Did it happen? And then was it consensual or not, right? So there needs to be like different kind of safeguards around, you know, charging and trying people for these kinds of crimes, right? Though, notably though, the LA Times notes that this Court of Appeals is predominantly, you know, a female, right? So this isn't like a bunch of old white dudes who are, you know, who are making this decision and don't understand what it's like to be a woman, right? And, you know, this isn't necessarily a ridiculous legal argument, though. And actually, the New York Times ran an article recently titled, quote, "Harvey Weinstein's conviction was fragile from the start." And it was written by Jodi Kantor, who, with Megan Twohey, broke the original story about Weinstein in the Times. She writes, quote, in this article, writes, quote, "The overturning of Harvey Weinstein's New York sex crimes conviction on Thursday morning may feel like a shocking reversal, but the criminal case against him has been fragile since the day it was filed. Prosecutors moved it forward with risky, boundary-pushing bets," end quote. So, you know, I mean, obviously she's no fan of Harvey Weinstein, but her argument was that he ended up being convicted. It was very faulty to begin with, and that it was shaky, and it was ripe for some kind of appeal like this. So, unfortunately, a new trial must take place, right? And we have a quote from the spokesperson for the Manhattan DA saying, quote, "We will do everything in our power to retry this case and remain steadfast in our commitment to survivors of sexual assault," end quote. Now, you might be saying, this is awful. Harvey Weinstein's going to be roaming free. That's not the case. He will still be in jail because he was also, while he was already in jail in New York, he was convicted in LA in 2022 and sentenced to 16 years in prison. That conviction could potentially be appealed now because his conviction in New York was used as part of the argument in the LA case, right? So, I could see an appeal being made like, well, one of the big reasons why he was convicted in LA was because he had already been convicted in New York, but that has now been overturned. So shouldn't this one be as well? But the thing, though, about the California case is that California and New York have different laws regarding admitting, testimony like that of other allegations. And California explicitly allows what's called prior bad acts evidence or testimony. And we have a quote here from the LA DA's office saying, quote, although we do not know what arguments the defense will raise on appeal, we are confident that our convictions will withstand appellate scrutiny. Our office stands ready to see that Mr. Weinstein faces the serious consequences of his deplorable conduct, end quote. So what is this all about, right? I've been going on. Most of you probably know, but I think just so we're all on the same page. So Harvey Weinstein was just a behemoth and an icon, or giant, maybe is the better word, in the independent movie world, right? He produced Shakespeare in Love and essentially created the modern idea of like the Oscar campaign, right? So notably Shakespeare in Love through kind of, industry, political, sweet talking and maneuvering, Shakespeare in Love ended up winning Best Picture that year instead of Saving Private Ryan, which was like the favorite and obviously the better film and the one that people still actually like. 25-ish years later, right? But he's also executive produced countless other classic films, like most of Quentin Tarantino's work. Also was one of the executive producers on the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the Scream franchise, Good Will Hunting, Paddington, The King's Speech, which kind of feels like another Shakespeare in Love, where it's like it's a good movie, but The Social Network should have won that year. Now, all of this going on, though, over decades, it was an open secret that Weinstein was creepy at best and a sexual predator at worst, right? And he used his power and influence to intimidate women into sexual favors and then keeping them quiet, right? And there were these accounts of dozens and dozens of women over the years who crossed paths with him and shared similar experiences of intimidation, harassment, and abuse, right? And he really became the face of the Me Too movement. Or rather, that makes it sound like he was leading the charge. He became like the main villain, right? The main antagonist of that movement. And the face of cancel culture when all of this kind of broke in late 2017. Like I mentioned before, the New York Times, I think Ronan Farrow had broken a story as well, but it really all broke open when the New York Times broke a story that detailed decades of abuse. And Weinstein apologized, but maintained his innocence and claimed that, everything was consensual. And this, just if you remember, you may be watching, you might be too young to remember this, but, this began an onslaught of breaking news every day with new allegations about your favorite celebrity. So, it would one day it'd be Kevin Spacey, and then Matt Lauer, and then John Lasseter from Pixar, and it just every day seemed like a new person that you admired or looked up to or just had interest in was actually this awful person, right? And I was in film school at the time. I was a junior, so especially since the Me Too movement spread across essentially all of society, but it originated in the film industry, and that seemed to be where a huge focus of it was. So in film school, we talked about this probably every single day for weeks, as we should have, right? And I think this was really important that this movement happened because it really brought, a deeper understanding from, it really helped well-meaning but oblivious men like myself have a deeper understanding of the dangers that every woman faces. Like, the hashtag Me Too, that was that's not just a phrase. Like, it was like every woman that you knew was posting something about it on social media saying, like, I've had an experience. And it just, I'm not saying, like, well, we didn't know anything about it. Like, we should have known. And we should have been more sensitive to this. But it was kind of like, I think, for white people, again, like myself, I'm not immune to any of this, and I'm willing to admit my own flaws here, right? I think kind of similar to the George Floyd protests in 2020. Like, we knew it was bad, but it didn't quite dawn on us yet. That was a very generationally transformative moment. And this was no exception when it came to gender issues and just safety, workplace safety, because that's ultimately what this all amounts to. So Weinstein basically became vilified and was essentially ostracized from the industry in all of public life. Like, he basically became a recluse. So obviously people have very strong reactions about this overturning of this conviction. So, people like Douglas Wigdor, who's an attorney who represented 2 pre-trial witnesses in New York, saying, quote, "Today's decision is a major step back in holding those accountable for acts of sexual violence. Courts routinely admit evidence of other uncharged acts where they assist juries in understanding issues concerning the intent, modus operandi, or scheme of the defendant. The jury was instructed on the relevance of this testimony, and overturning the verdict is tragic in that it will require the victims to endure yet another trial," end quote. We also have a quote here from Silence Breakers, which is a group that includes Ashley Judd and Rose McGowan, 2 of Weinstein's most kind of visible victims. The group Silence Breakers said, quote, "The news today is not only disheartening, but it is profoundly unjust. But this ruling does not diminish the validity of our experiences or our truth. It's merely a setback. When survivors everywhere broke their silence in 2017, the world changed. We continue to stand strong and advocate for that change. We will continue to fight for justice for survivors everywhere." So that's the majority opinion by most people. Again, you're gonna be hard pressed. Even people who are like, "Oh, everything's so woke and you can't say anything to a woman now," all this stuff. Even they agree Harvey Weinstein's a scumbag. I don't think there's anyone who's in support of him. But there are a few, right? So we have a quote here from Weinstein's lawyer, Arthur Aidala, who was his lawyer in this appellate case, saying, quote, "We all worked very hard, and this is a tremendous victory for every criminal defendant in the state of New York," end quote. Okay. And we also have a quote here from Weinstein's spokesperson, Judah Engelmeyer, saying, quote, "We're studying the appeal and we don't know the full ramifications of it yet. Harvey doesn't know about the ruling yet. We can't call him in jail. He can only call us. We've emailed him. His lawyers have emailed him, but he hasn't yet responded. His team is cautiously excited," end quote. But eventually he did find out, Weinstein did, and he reportedly cried tears of joy when he heard the news and just kept saying, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Probably because he's like, "Shit, I gotta get the fuck out of here," right? And reportedly he's looking forward to leaving, his minimum security prison in New York State and heading back to New York City. He's still going to be held. Again, he's not just going to be roaming around. He's still going to be held for retrial. And he's set to make a court appearance this Wednesday on May 1st. And he's probably excited about this because the dude is suffering from some health problems. He's got heart problems, sleep apnea, diabetes, rotting teeth. He's legally blind. And I think once he was released, he was admitted to Bellevue Hospital, and they were just like, "This dude's a fucking mess," right? So I think I've made how I feel about this pretty clear. Again, this is very disappointing. But again, at least based off of the way New York laws are currently structured, this is legally sound, right? Technicalities are annoying and inconvenient, but they do matter, right? The man is 100% guilty, right? And again, my kind of view on, sexual harassment, assault, or rape allegations is, we do have an innocent until proven guilty legal system. But that being said, usually if there's a pattern, the more unconnected people make similar allegations, the more likely these allegations are true. If it was just one person, then you can maybe argue. But honestly, once you even get up to 2 unrelated people make the same allegation against someone, usually that indicates a pattern, right? It reinforces the truth of these allegations, right? And again, this isn't the end of the world because he's still going to be in jail. Again, the LA conviction is probably not going to be overturned, and he's 72. He's in horrible health. I don't see the dude living another 16 years, right? But I do understand the potential legal ramifications. It sets a precedent, right? And it's a matter of principle that, it speaks like I think who was it, the judge who wrote the dissenting opinion, that basically this basically empowers other defendants with similar charges going forward, right? But again, it's inconvenient and really frustrating and disappointing, but this does show the virtue of an impartial judicial system, which we have a very fucked up judicial system in the United States, but there is something at its core that that this has value in that, innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And if the judge allowed such testimony, then the judge should have known better, right? And, we have a quote here from Daniel Medwed, who is a professor of law and criminal justice at Northeastern University in Boston, saying, quote, "You could think of New York as a dinosaur," in terms of its laws about not admitting testimony like this. "You could think of New York as a dinosaur, but I think of it as New York being very vigilant of protecting the civil rights of defendants. It's a traditional view, maybe it's a lingering civil libertarian view, that the jury punishes someone not for who they are alleged to be, but what they've done in this case. Loosening the rules of evidence could be a slippery slope to an erosion of all of our rights," end quote. Slippery slope arguments are oftentimes flawed because they're not even the same slope. They'll be like, "Oh, if we do this, then this will happen." And I'm like, well, those aren't necessarily logically connected. You just think they might be. But I think, again, to a point, I kind of agree with this guy here that, ultimately Harvey Weinstein has the same rights as everybody else. And ultimately his rights were technically under New York law. They were trampled. So this is disappointing. It's going to be disappointing because now there's going to have to be another trial, and witnesses have to decide if they want to re-testify, and that could be really traumatizing for them. But again, this whole kind of thing just kind of speaks to, are we in the end of cancel culture? Again, no one's excited and accepting Harvey Weinstein with open arms again. But again, that movement seemed so potent for so long. And again, to a point, it may have been an overcorrection at times, but again, it was a necessary overcorrection. That you needed to have the overcorrection so you can then kind of settle into where you need to be, right? But with something like the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard case, that seemed like a huge turning point where, again, the power had been shifted back to abusers, or at least alleged abusers, right? Just to be fair. But, again, is this another huge turning point? Again, Bill Cosby had his conviction overturned, also on a technicality, though a different technicality. So again, I think these prosecutors just need to do a better job and stop using dubious legal methods and just do it so that it is ironclad, so we don't have issues like this again. But, only time will tell, I'm sure. Even without those extra pieces of testimony, he's still going to be found guilty. And if not, he's going to L.A. So it's either, where do you want to be in jail? Do you want to be in L.A. or upstate New York? So only time will tell with that.